It always asks that. We have to figure out why. Does it think that I don't plan on streaming when I stream? I mean, really. Fuck. Desktop audio, you're gonna be the bane of my existence. Okay, well, I'm live. Guess I'll fill this up. Yeah. Okay. And 3 moments didn't put the right thing up anyway, even after it made me change it. 3 moments, your sad disappointment in everything I do. Sound like my parents. Okay. Who else really know that in the old horror movies, Dracula and Frankenstein and all the other cool ones, they used Tchaikovsky's ballet. And literally, Swan Lake was the most haunting music they could find. Which, admittedly, Swan Lake is a very haunting piece. That's probably why it works so well. Okay, I'm posting stuff to the Discords. So, do that while waiting for some people to come in. I do have a couple of, well, 1 or 2 cool things planned for the night, but, you know, what I may find cool, other people may find, well, lame as fuck. Yeah. You know, I was thinking, well, watch a movie, or at least as much as a movie as we can watch. Then I'll do some spookiness. Because spookiness is why I'm here tonight. Because I like spooky movies, if you haven't figured that out. And I like classical spooky movies. Because there's no spook like classical spook. Admittedly, I couldn't do the stuff I really wanted to do because, you know, copyright issues. Because Universal backdoored their way into copywriting stuff, so. Because they couldn't, you know, they couldn't copyright the story. So they put a copyright on the makeup. So anyone who tries to use that particular makeup, Universal will go after them. Because Universal Studios is Universal Studios. What's that one? No, Foxy Old Train Checkouts. That was me scratching my chest. Yeah, because there's hair. I am covered in fur. Get used to it. Okay. Damn it, my eyes are always trying to go blurry on me. That sucks. Okay, well. as much Discording as I wanted to do is done. Who the hell else is coming on now? Okay. So, let me switch over to the chatty chat window, because I like to chats. And normally, just gonna chat up until 15 minutes into the stream, then get into doing stuff I was gonna do. Because, you know, that's the way you do it. And I did mention that, yeah, we're gonna sneak in, watch a movie real quick. It's not a long one, but it's kind of cool, so. You know, I would love to have shown the 1931 Frankenstein, but or any version of Frankenstein. But I'm trying to keep myself, you know, off the copyright list. So I try to find things I can actually show and not worry about, and it's not like I'm affiliate yet, so I'm not getting paid to do any of this, so I can't exactly handle any fines. Yeah. I am not fine at all. Nope. Okay, what time do we have? I have to keep adjusting my screen because I cannot see shit because of my camera. Okay. Okay, so we've only gone 7 minutes. I kind of want people to show up for this because, you know, when you plan moderately cool stuff, you want people to be around for it. Understandable, right? Sorry, I keep scratching. I hope it all flees. Pretty sure it all flees. Oh, well. Oh, there is no one here but my bots. Okay, well. Oh, and Death Walker just went live. And who's the sleepy doggy girl? Oh, puppy. Oh, puppy. Okay, if this is still going, then I guess I know who we'll raid. So. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Dun 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 dun. So, guess I'll kick the movie on. I want to keep it. I want to keep it close to the 15 because, you know, tradition. Because, you know, I want to yak you guys for 15 minutes and I don't want to talk in the theater. The thing with theaters, it's kind of a bummer that Regal Cinemas are filing for bankruptcy. That's sad. I mean, they were part of United Artists. Or United Artists was part of them anyway. Now, we're getting close to the 10-minute mark. So, you know what? Let's go ahead and head over to the theater, shall we? I'm not going to tell you to get popcorn or Coke since it's not going to be that long of a film. So, let's see. Wait another couple minutes, see if anyone wants to pop in. So I don't have any of the sound alerts set up on here. Pretty sure I don't have sound alerts set up in here. No, I got sound alerts set up in here. Oh, excuse me. Man. That kind of sucked. There you go. You know, it's interesting that, trivial knowledge bit here, but Frankenstein was not considered horror when it came out. They didn't officially make a horror genre until, I think, until 35 when they started officially calling things horror movies. I mean, I think that's cool, but that's me. We are at 11, so...
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
Yeah, we said. Are you here for entertainment? Because, I'm trying to be. Anyone else? Anyone else? Before I dim the lights. Should I cue the overture? Overture. Dim the lights. This is it. The night of nights. Okay. Well, getting everything else ready. I'm leaning off to the side a little. Let me move myself in a little bit more. There we go. That's a good spot. Okay, well, you don't see it until I switch screens. Well, we're at 13:13. I'm going to start it at 15 minutes, so. Put me in the right spot. Okay. Okay, we are. Here we are, born to be kings, we're the princes of the universe. Anyone? Fry. Hello. Good. Coming up on 30 seconds. 30 seconds before the movie. And hope to God it'll play properly. Oh. A week or so worth of planning. Okay. 11, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And roll film. for it. That's a silent movie. I don't know why I'm adjusting the volume. Oh, sorry. Da, 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 da. Just before the experiment. Everyone be able to read cursive. Kind of an upbeat and hopeful tune, isn't it? Ah. So you can get all the pieces thoroughly. Notice, just chemicals. No lightning. Just files and tubes and chemicals. Kind of strange to think that the Rocky Horror Picture Show is more accurate than the Universal Studios. Rise, my monster, rise! State-of-the-art special effects. This definitely does make it look like it's more magic than science. What have I done? passed out. I think I'll go. What's that? You? Why are you two places? Ta-da. This music's romantic. Such a different image of Frankenstein. Considering Mary Shelley didn't really describe what he looked like in the book. I shall never be loved. See, that just shows that he was magical instead of, you know, scientifically made. Dun, dun, dun. Charles Ogle. Dun, dun, dun. I don't know. And that would be the credits. Okay, let's bring up flights. Bring us back to the century. There we go. So, that was done in 1910. If you didn't notice that in the credits. Now, here's the thing, chat. I'm going to stray from my normal wear and actually read a chaptered story. And I'm going to read Frankenstein. Frankenstein. So, I think we will go old school with this and go ahead and do my good old reading screen. Oh, wait. There we go. And, yeah. I don't have a book cover I can use for it. So we'll just start with the preface and we'll go with there, okay? Preface. The event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin and some of these physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence. I shall not be supposed as according to the remotest degree of serious faith to such an imagination, yet in assuming it as the basis of a work of fancy, I have not considered myself as merely weaving a series of supernatural terrors. The event on which the interest of the story depends is exempt from disadvantages of a mere tale of spectres or enchantments. It was recommended by the novelty of the situations which it develops, and, however impossible as a physical fact, affords a point of view to the imagination for the delineation of human passions more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations existing events can yield. I have thus endeavored to preserve the truth of the elementary principles of human nature, while I have not scrupled the innovative upon the combinations. The Iliad, the tragic poetry of Greece, Shakespeare in The Tempest and Midsummer Night's Dream, and most especially Milton in Paradise Lost, conform to this rule, and the most humble novelist who seeks to confer or receive amusement from his labors may, without presumption, apply to prose fiction a license, or rather a rule, from the adoption of which many exquisite combinations of human feeling have resulted in the highest specimens of poetry. The occurrence on lost my spot. Hate when that happens. Oh, the circumstance on which my story rests has suggested a casual conversation. It is commenced partly as a source of amusement and partly as an expense of exercising any untried resources of mind. The other motives were mingled with these as the work proceeded. I am by no means indifferent to the nature and the manner of which moral tendencies exist in the sentiments of character or it contains shall affect the reader. Yet my chief concern in this respect has been limited to avoiding the unnerving effects of novels of the present day, and to the exhibition of domestic affection, and the excellence of universal virtue. The opinions which naturally spring from the character and situation of the hero are by no means to be conceived as existing aways from my own conviction, nor is any inference justly to be drawn from the following pages prejudicing any philosophical doctrine of whatever kind. It is a subject also of additional interest to the author that this story was begun in the majestic region where the scene is principally laid, and in society which cannot cease to be regretted. I passed the summer in 1816 in the environs of Geneva. The season was cold and rainy, and in the evenings we were crowded around the blazing wood fire, and occasionally amused ourselves with some German stories of ghosts, which happened to fall into our hands. These tales excited us in a playful desire of imitation. Two other friends, a tale from the pen of one whom would be far more acceptable to the public than anything I can ever hope to produce, and myself produced to write each a story founded on some supernatural occurrence. The weather, however, suddenly became serene, and my two friends left me on a journey among the Alps, and lost in the magnificent scenes which they present. All memory of the ghostly visions and following tale is the only one that has been completed. Hello? My lights are acting funky, sorry. That's never a good thing. We can try this, letter 1. Fuck. Hello? Hello there. Anyone? Anyone? Wait. What's this switch do? Let's see. Ow! Damn. Shocked me. Let's try this again. And... hold on. I got it. Here it goes. Hello. Anyway. Yeah, that's me being goofy. I just had to do this kind of setup. I hope you guys enjoy the fact I do this. Anyway, letter 1. To Mrs. Seville, England, St. Petersburg, December 11th, 1700s. You will rejoice to hear that no disaster has accompanied the commencement of the enterprise which you have regarded with such evil forebodings. I arrived here yesterday, and my first task is to assure my dear sister of my welfare and increasing confidence in the success of my undertaking. I am already far north of London, and as I walk in the streets of Petersburg, I feel a cold northern breeze play upon my cheeks, which braces my nerves and fills me with delight. Do you understand this feeling? This breeze, which has traveled from the regions towards which I am advancing, gives me a foretaste of those icy climes. Inspirited by this wind of promise, my daydreams become more fervent and vivid. I try in vain to be persuaded that this hole is the seat of frost, desolation. It ever presents itself to my imagination as region of beauty and delight. There, Margaret, the sun is forever visible, its broad disk just skirting the horizon and diffusing the perpetual splendor. There, for with your leave, my sister, I will put some trust in preceding navigators. The snow and frost are banished, and sailing over a calm sea, we may be wafted to the lands surpassing in wonders and in beauty every region hitherto discovered in the habitable globe. Its productions and features may be without example, as the phenomena of the heavenly bodies undoubtedly are in those undiscovered solitudes. What may not be expected in a country of eternal light? I may there discover the wondrous power which attracts the needle, and may regulate 1,000 celestial observations that require this voyage to render their seeming eccentricities consistent forever. I shall satiate my ardent curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man. These are my enticements, and they are sufficient to conquer all fear of danger or death, and to induce me to commence the laborious journey with the joy a child feels when he embarks in a little boat, with his holiday mates, on an expedition of discovery up his native river. But supposing all these conjectures to be false, you cannot contest the inestimable benefits from which I shall confer on all mankind to the last generation, by discovering a passage near the pole to those countries, to reach which at present so many months are requisite, or by ascertaining the secret of the magnets, which, if at all possible, can only be effected by the undertaking of such a mine. These reflections have dispelled the agitation which I began my letter, and I feel my heart glow with the enthusiasm which elevates me to heaven. For nothing contributes so much to tranquilize the mind as a steady purpose, a point on which my soul may fix its intellectual eye. This expedition has been the favorite dream of my early years. I have read with ardor the accounts of the various voyages which have been made in the prospect of arriving at the North Pacific Ocean, through the seas which surround the pole. You may remember that a history of all the voyages for purposes of discovery composed the whole of our good Uncle Thomas's library. My education was neglected, yet I was passionately fond of reading. These volumes were my study day and night, and my familiarity with them increased that regent from which I felt as a child, on leaning that my father's dying injunction had forbidden my uncle to allow me to embark in a seafaring life. These visions faded when I pursued, but for the first time, those poets whose effusions entranced my soul, lifted it to heaven, I also became a poet, and for 1 year lived in the paradise of my own creation. I imagined that I might also obtain a niche in the temple where the homes of Homer and Shakespeare are consecrated. You are well acquainted with my failure, and how heavily I bore the disappointment. But just at that time I inherited the fortune of my cousin, and my thoughts were turned into the channel of their early bent. 6 years have passed since I resolved my present undertaking. I can, even now, remember the hour from which I dedicated myself to the great enterprise. I commenced by injuring my body to hardship. I accompanied the whale fishers on several expeditions to the North Sea. I voluntarily endured cold, famine, thirst, and want of sleep. I often worked harder than the common sailor during the day, and devoted my nights to the study of mathematics, the theory of medicine, and those branches of physical science from which the naval adventurer might derive a great practical advantage. Twice I actually hired myself as an undermate in the Greenland whaler, and acquitted myself to admiration. I must own I felt a little proud when my captain offered me the second dignity in the vessel. and entreated me to remain with the greatest earnestness, so valuable did he consider my services. And now, dear Margaret, do I not deserve to accomplish some great purpose? My life might have been passed in ease and luxury, but I preferred glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path. Oh, that some encouraging voice would answer in the affirmative. My courage and my resolution is firm. My hopes fluctuate, and my spirits are often depressed. I am about to proceed on a long and difficult voyage, the emergencies of which will demand my fortitude. I am required not only to raise the spirits of others, but sometimes to sustain my own, when theirs are falling. This is the most favorable period for traveling in Russia. They fly quickly over the snow in their sledges. The motion is pleasant, and, in my opinion, far more agreeable than that of the English stagecoach. Cold is not excessive if you are wrapped in furs, a dress which I have already adopted, for there is a great difference between walking on deck and remaining seated motionless for hours, when no exercise prevents the blood from actually freezing in your veins. I have no ambition to lose my life on this post road between St. Petersburg and Archangel. I shall depart for the latter town in a fortnight or 3 weeks, and my intention is to hire a ship there, which can easily be done by paying the insurance for the owner, and to engage as many sailors as I think necessary among those who are accustomed to whale fishing. I do not intend to sail until the month of June. And when shall I return? Ah, dear sister, how can I answer that question? If I succeed, many, many months, perhaps years, will pass before you and I may meet. If I fail, you will never see me again, soon or ever. Farewell, my dear, excellent Margaret. Heaven shower down blessings upon you, and save me, that I may again and again testify my gratitude for all your love and kindness. Your affectionate brother, R. Walton. Hey, Guilty, nice to see you pop in. Letter 2 to Mrs. Seville, England, from Archangel, 28th of March, 1700. How slowly the time passes here. Encompassed as I am by frost and snow, yet a second step is taken towards my enterprise. I have hired a vessel, and am occupied in collecting my sailors, whom I have already engaged appear to be men whom I can depend, and are certainly possessed of dauntless courage. But I have wants which I have never been able to satisfy, and the absence of the object of which I now feel as an almost severe evil. I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate in my joy. If I have been assailed by disappointment, no one will endeavor to sustain me in the direction. I shall commit my thoughts to paper. It is true, but that is a poor medium for the communication of feeling. I desire the company of a man who would sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. Doing pretty good. I'm getting into Frankenstein. I bitterly feel the want of a friend. I have no one near me, gentle yet courageous, possessed of a cultivated as well as a capacious mind, whose tastes are like my own, to approve or amend my plan. How would such a friend repair the faults in your poor brother? I am too ardent in execution, and too impatient of difficulties, but it is still a greater evil to me that I am self-educated. For the first 14 years of my life I ran wild on a common, and read nothing but our Uncle Thomas's books of voyages. At that age I became acquainted with the celebrated poets of our own country, but it was only when I had ceased to be in my power to derive its most beautiful benefits from such conviction that I perceived the necessity of becoming acquainted with more languages than that of my own native country. Now I am 28, and am in reality more illiterate than many school boys of 15. It is true that I have thought more, and that my daydreams are more extended to the magnificent, but they want, as the painters call it, keeping. And I greatly need a friend who would have sense enough to not despise me as a romantic, and affectionate enough for me to endeavor to regulate my mind. Well, these are useless complaints. I shall certainly find no friend on the wide ocean, not even here in Archangel, among merchants and seamen. Yet some feelings, and allied to the dross of human nature, beat even in these rugged bosoms. My lieutenant, for instance, is a man of wonderful courage and enterprise. He is madly desirous of glory. He is an Englishman, and in the midst of national and professional prejudices, unsoftened by cultivation, means some sort of the noblest endowments for humanity. I first became acquainted with him on board the whale vessel, finding that he was unemployed in the city. I easily engaged him to assist in my enterprise. The master is a person of excellent disposition, and is remarkable in the ship for his gentleness, and the mildness of his discipline. He is, indeed, of so amicable nature that he will not hunt, a favorite of almost every and only amusement here, because he cannot endure the spill of blood. He is, moreover, heroically generous. Some years ago he loved a young Russian lady, of moderate fortune, and having amassed a considerable sum in prize money, the father of the girl consented to match. He saw his mistress once before the destined ceremony, but she was bathed in tears, and, throwing herself at his feet, entreated him to spare her, confessing at the same time that she loved another, but that he was poor, and that her father would never consent to the union. My generous friend supplanted the supplicant, and on being informed of her name and her lover instantly abandoned his pursuit. He had already bought a farm with his money, on which he had designed to pass the remainder of his life, but he bestowed the whole on his rival, together with the remains of the prize money to the purchase stock, and then he himself solicited the young woman's father to consent to her marriage with her lover. But the old man decidedly refused, thinking himself bound in honor to my friend, who, when he found the father inexorable, quitted this country, nor returned until he heard that the former mistress was married accordingly to her inclinations. What a noble fellow, you will exclaim. He is so, but that he has passed all his life on board a vessel, and has scarcely an idea beyond the rope and the shroud. But do not suppose that, because I complain a little, or because I can conceive the consolation of my toils, which I may never know, that I am wavering in my resolution. Those are fixed as fate. My voyage is only now delayed until the weather shall permit the embarkation. The winter has been dreadfully severe, but the spring promises well, and it is considered as remarkably early season, so that perhaps I may sail sooner than I expected. I shall do nothing rashly. You know me sufficiently to confide in my prudence and considerateness whenever the safety of others is committed to my care. I cannot describe to you the sensations of the near prospect of my undertaking. It is impossible to communicate to you the conception of the trembling sensation, half pleasurable and half fearful, with which I am prepared to depart. I am going to unexplored regions, to the land of mist and snow. But I shall kill no albatross, therefore do not be alarmed for my safety. I shall meet you again after having traversed immense seas and returned to the most southern cape of Africa or America. I dare not expect such success, yet I cannot bear to look at the reverse of the picture. Continue to write me to every opportunity. I may receive your letters, though the chance is very doubtful, on some occasions when I need them the most to support my spirits. I love you very tenderly. Remember me with affection, should you never hear from me again. Your affectionate brother, Robert Walton. There's a lot of stuff that people don't realize was in Frankenstein. This is a guy who, well, I'll get into it. Letter 3. To Mrs. Seville, England, July 7th, 1700. My dear sister, I write a few lines in haste to say that I am safe and well advanced on my voyage. This letter will reach England by a merchantman now on its homeward voyage from Archangel, more fortunate than I, who may not see the native land perhaps for many years. I am, however, in good spirits. My men are bold and apparently firm on purpose, nor do the floating sheets of ice that continuously pass us, indicating the dangers of the region towards which we are advancing, appear to dismay them. We have already reached a very high latitude, but it is the height of summer, and although not so warm as England, the southern gales, which blow us steadily towards the shores which I ardently desire to attain, breathe a degree of renovating warmth which I have not expected. No incidents have hitherto fallen us that would make a figure a letter. One or two stiff gales and the breaking of a mast are accidents which experienced sailors scarcely remember to record, and I shall be well to content if nothing worse happens to us during the voyage. Adieu, my dear Margaret. Be assured that for my own sake, and as well as yours, I will not rashly encounter danger. I will be cool, persevering, and prudent. Remember me to all my English friends. Most affectionately yours, R.W. Letter 4. To Mrs. Seville, England, August 5th. So strange an accident has happened to us that I cannot forbear recording it, although it is very probable that you will see me before the papers can come into your possession. Last Monday, July 31st, we were nearly surrounded by ice, which closed in on the ships on all sides, scarcely leaving her stratum in which she floated. Our situation was somewhat dangerous, especially as we were encompassed round by a very thick fog. We accordingly lay to, hoping that some change would take place in the atmosphere and the weather. Around 2 o'clock the mist cleared away, and we beheld, stretched out in every direction, vast and irregular plains of ice, which seemed to have no end. Some of my comrades groaned, and my own mind began to grow watchful in anxious thoughts, when a strange sight suddenly attracted our attention. Diverted our solitude from our situation. We perceived a low carriage, fixed on a sledge and drawn by dogs, pass on towards the north, at the distance of half a mile, being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, sat in the sledge and guided the dogs. We watched the rapid progress of the traveler through our scopes, until he was lost among the distant inequalities of the ice. This appearance excited our unqualified wonder. We were, as we believed, many hundred miles from any land, but this apparition seemed to denote that it was not, in reality, so distant as we had supposed. Shut in, however, by ice, it was impossible to follow his track, which we had observed on the greatest attention. About 2 hours after this occurrence, we heard the ground sea, and before night the ice broke and freed our ship. We, however, lay to until morning, fearing to encounter those large loose masses which float about after breaking up the ice. I profited of this time to rest for a few hours. In the morning, however, as soon as it was light, I went upon the deck and found all the sailors busy on one side of the vessel, apparently talking to someone in the sea. It was, in fact, a sledge, like that we had seen before, which had drifted towards us in the night. On a large fragment of ice, only one dog remained alive, but there was a human being within it, and the sailors were persuading to enter the vessel. He was not, as the other travelers seemed to be, a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered land, but a European. When I appeared on deck, the master said, "Here is our captain, and he will not allow you to perish on open sea." On perceiving me, the stranger addressed me in English, although with a foreign accent. "Before I come on your vessel," said he, "will you have the kindness to inform me whither you are bound?" You may conceive my astonishment on hearing such a question addressed to me from the man of the brink of destruction, and to whom I should have supposed that my vessel would have been a resource which he would have not exchanged for the most precious wealth earth can afford. I replied, however, that we were on a voyage of discovery towards the northern pole. Upon hearing this, he appeared satisfied, and consented to come aboard. Good God, Margaret! If you had seen the man who thus capitulated for his safety, your surprise would have been boundless. His limbs were nearly frozen, and his body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering. I never saw a man in such wretched condition. We attempted to carry him to the cabin, but as soon as he had quitted the fresh air, he fainted. We accordingly brought him back to the deck, and restored him to animation by rubbing him with brandy, and forcing him to swallow a small quantity. As soon as he shewed signs of life, we wrapped him up in blankets and placed him near the chimney of the kitchen stove. By slow degrees he recovered, and ate a little soup, which restored him wonderfully. 2 days passed in this manner before he was able to speak, and I often feared that his sufferings had deprived him of understanding. When he had some measure recovered, I removed him to my own cabin, and attended on him as much as my duty could permit. I never saw a more interesting creature. His eyes have generally an expression of wildness, and even madness. But there are moments when, if anyone performs an act of kindness towards him, or does him any of the most trifling service, his whole countenance is lightened up, as it were, with a beam of benevolence and sweetness that I never saw equaled. But he is generally melancholy and despairing, and sometimes he gnashes his teeth, as if impatient of the weight of the woes that opposes him. When my guest was little recovered, I had great trouble to keep off the men, who wished to ask him 1,000 questions, but I would not allow him to be tormented by their idle curiosity in a state of body and mind whose restoration evidently depended on entire repose. Once, however, my lieutenant asked why he had come so far on the ice in so strange a vehicle. His countenance instantly assumed the aspect of deepest gloom, and replied, "To seek the one who fled from me." "And did that man whom you pursued travel in the same fashion?" "Yes." "Then I fancy we have seen him, for the day before we picked you up, we saw some dogs drawing a sledge, with a man on it across the ice." This aroused the stranger's attention, and he asked a multitude of questions concerning the route which the Damon, as he called him, had pursued. Soon after, when he was alone with me, he said, "I have doubtless excited your curiosity, as well as that of these good people, but you are too considerate to make inquiries." "Certainly, it would indeed be very impertinent and inhuman in me to trouble you with inquisitive of mine. And yet you rescued me from a strange and perilous situation. You have benevolently restored me to life." Soon after this he inquired if I thought that he, breaking up the ice, had destroyed the other sledge. I replied that I could not answer with any degree of certainty, for the ice had not broken until near midnight, and the traveler might have arrived in a place of safety before that time. But of this I could not judge. From this, the stranger seemed very eager to be upon deck, to watch for the sledge which had been appeared. But I persuaded him to remain in the cabin, for he is too weak to sustain the rawness of the atmosphere. But I have promised that someone should watch for him, and give him instant notice if any new object should appear in the sight. Such is my journal of what relates to the strange occurrence up to this present day. The stranger has gradually improved in health, but is very silent, and appears uneasy when anyone except myself enters the cabin. Yet his manners are so conciliating and gentle that the sailors are all interested in him, although they have not had very little communication with him. For my own part, I begin to love him as a brother, and as his companion in deep grief fills me with sympathy and compassion. He must have been a noble creature in his better days, being even now in the wreck of so attractive and amicable. I said in one of my letters, my dear Margaret, that I should find no friend to the wide ocean. Yet I found a man who, before his spirit had been broken by misery, I should have been happy to have possessed as a brother into my heart. I shall continue my journal concerning the stranger intervals, although I have any fresh incidents to record. August 13th. My affection for the guest increases every day. He excites at once an admiration and pity in my astonishing degree. How can I see so noble a creature destroyed by misery without feeling the most poignant grief? He is so gentle, yet so wise. His mind is so cultivated, and when he speaks, although his words are cold with the choicest art, yet they flow with rapidity and unparalleled eloquence. He is now much recovered from his illness, and is continually on deck, apparently watching for the sledge that preceded his own. Yet, although unhappy, he is not so utterly occupied by his own misery, but that he interests himself deeply with the employments of others. He had asked me many questions concerning my design, and I related my little history frankly to him. He appeared pleased with my confidence, and suggested several alterations to my plan, which I shall find exceedingly useful. There is no pedantry in his manner, and all he does appear to spring so early to the interest of instinctively takes the welfare of those around him. He is often overcome with gloom, and then he sits by himself and tries to overcome all that is sullen and unsocial in his humor. The paradoxisms pass him like a cloud from before the sun, though the dejection never leaves him. I have endeavored to win his confidence, and I trust that I have succeeded. One day I mentioned to him the desire that I had always felt of finding a friend who might sympathize with me, and direct me by his counsel. I said I did not belong to the class of men who are offended by advice. I am self-educated, and perhaps I hardly rely sufficiently upon my own powers. I wish, therefore, that my companion should be wiser and more experienced than myself, to confirm and support me, nor have I believed it impossible to find a true friend. I agree with you, replied the stranger, and believing that friendship is not only desirable, but a possible acquisition. I once had a friend, the most noble of human creatures, and am entitled, therefore, to judge respecting in friendship. You have hope, and the world before you, but have no cause for despair. But I have lost everything, and cannot begin life anew. As he said this, his countenance became expressive of calm, settled grief that touched me to the heart. But he was silent, and presently retiring to his cabin. Even broken in spirit as he is, no one can feel more deeply than he does the beauties of nature. The starry sky, the sea, and every sight afforded by those wonderful regions seems still to have the power of elevating his soul from earth. Such a man has a double essence. He may suffer misery, but be overwhelmed by disappointments, and yet he has retired himself. He will be like the celestial spirit that has a halo around him, within whose circle no grief or folly ventures. Will you laugh at my enthusiasm I express concerning this divine wanderer? If you do, you must have certainly lost that sympathy which was once your characteristic charm. Yet, if you will, smile at the warmth of my expressions, while I find every day in you cause for repeating them. August 19th. Yesterday the stranger said to me, "You may easily perceive, Captain Walton, that I have suffered great and unparalleled misfortunes. I have determined once that the memory of these evils should die with me, but you have won me to alter my determination. You seek for knowledge and wisdom, as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratifications of your wishes may not be the serpents that sting you, as mine has been. I do not know that the relation of my misfortunes will be of use to you, yet, if you are inclined, listen to my tale. I believe that the strange incidents connected with my will afford a view of my nature, which may enlarge your faculties and understanding. You will hear of powers and occurrences, such as you have been accustomed to believe impossible. But I do not doubt that my tale conveys in its series internal evidence of truth and the events of which it is composed. You may easily conceive that I was much gratified by the offered communication. Yet I could not endure that he should renew his grief by the recital of his misfortunes. I felt the greatest eagerness to hear the promised narrative, partly from curiosity and partly from a strong desire to ameliorate his life, if it were in my power. I expressed these things in my answer. "I thank you," he replied, "for your sympathy, but it is useless. My fate is nearly fulfilled. I wait but for one event, and then I shall repose in peace. I understand your feeling," continued he, perceiving that I wished to interrupt him. "But you are mistaken, my friend. If thus you allow me to name you, nothing can alter my destiny. Listen to my history, and you will perceive how irrevocably it is determined." He then told me that he would commence his narrative the next day, when I should be at leisure. This promise drew me should be engaged. I will at least make notes. This manuscript will doubtlessly afford you the greatest pleasure, but to me, who know him, and to hear it from his own lips, with what interest and sympathy shall I read it in some future day? Ouch. And that is just the prefix. And now into the story we go. Chapter 1. I am by birth a Genovese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors have been for many years consulars and syndics, and my father had filled several public situations with an honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to public businesses. He passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country, and it was not until the decline of life that he thought of marrying, and bestowing upon the state sons who might carry his virtues and his name down to prosperity. The circumstances of his marriage illustrate his character. I cannot refrain from relating. One of his most intimate friends was a merchant who, from a flourishing state, fell, through numerous mischances, into poverty. This man, whose name was Beaufort, was a proud and unbending disposition, and could not bear to live in poverty and oblivion in the same country where he had formerly been distinguished for rank and magnificence. Having paid his debts, therefore, in the most honorable manner, he retreated with his daughter to the house of Lucerne, the town of Lucerne, which she lived unknown and in wretchedness. My father loved Beaufort with the truest friendship, and was deeply grieved by his retreats to the unfortunate circumstances. He grieved also for the loss of his society, and resolved to seek him out and endeavor to persuade him to begin the world again through the credit of assistance. Beaufort had taken effectual measures to conceal himself, and it was 10 months before my father discovered his abode. Overjoyed at the discovery, he hastened to the house, which was situated in a mean street near the race. But when he entered, misery and despair alone welcomed him. Beaufort had saved but a very small sum of money from the wreck of his fortunes, but it was sufficient to provide him with sustenance for some months, and in the meantime he hoped to procure some respectable employment in a merchant's house. The interval was consequently spent in inaction. His grief only became more deep and rankling. When he had leisure for reflection, and at length it took fast hold of his mind, at the end of those 3 months he lay on bed of sickness, incapable of any exertion. His daughter attended him with the greatest tenderness, but she saw with despair that their little fund was rapidly decreasing, and that there was no other prospect of support. But Caroline Beaufort possessed a mind of an uncommon mold, and her courage rose to support her in adversity. She procured plain work, she plaited straw, and by various means contrived to earn a pittance scarcely sufficient to support life. Several months passed in this manner. Her father grew worse. Time was more entirely occupied by attending him. Her means of subsistence decreased, and in the 10th month her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and a beggar. This last blow overcame her, and she knelt by Beaufort's coffin, weeping bitterly, when my father entered the chamber. He came like a protecting spirit to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care, and after the interment of his friend, conducted her to Geneva and placed her under the protection of a relation. 2 years after his event, Caroline became his wife. When my father became the husband and the parent, he found this time so occupied by the duties of his new station that he relinquished many of his public employments and devoted himself to the education of his children. Of these, I was the eldest, and the destined successor to his labors and utility. No creature could have more tender parents than mine. My improvement in health were their constant care, especially as I remained for several years their only child. Before I continue my narrative, I must record an incident which took place when I was 4 years of age. My father had a sister, whom he tenderly loved, and whose marriage early in life to an Italian gentleman. Soon after her marriage, she had accompanied her husband into this house to his native country. At some years, my father had very little communication with her. About the time I mentioned she died, and a few months afterwards he received a letter from her husband, acquainting him with the intention of marrying an Italian lady, and requesting my father take charge of the infant Elizabeth, the only child of his deceased sister. "It is my wish," he said, "that you should consider her as your own daughter, and educate her thus. Her mother's fortune is secured to her, the documents of which will commit to her your keeping. Reflect upon this proposition, and decide whether you would prefer educating your niece yourself, to her being brought up by a stepmother." My father did not hesitate and immediately went to Italy, that he might accompany the little Elizabeth to her future home. I have overheard my mother say that she was at the time the most beautiful child she had ever seen, and shewed signs even then of the gentle and affectionate disposition. Those indications, and a desire to bind so as closely as possible to the ties of domestic love, determined my mother to consider Elizabeth as my future wife, a resign which she never found reason to repent. Okay. From this time, Elizabeth Lavenza became my playfellow, and as we grew older, my friend. She was docile and good-tempered, yet gay and playful as a summer insect. Although she was lively and animated, her feelings were strong and deep, and her disposition uncommonly affectionate. No one could better enjoy liberty, yet no one could submit more grace than she did to constraint and caprice. Her imagination was luxuriant, yet her capability of appreciation was great. Her person was the image of her mind. Her hazel eyes, although as lively as a bird's, possessed an attractive softness. Her figure was light and airy, and, though capable of enduring great fatigue, she appeared the most fragile creature in the world. While I admired her understanding and fancy, I loved to depend on her, as I should a favorite animal, and I never saw so much grace, both person and mind, united in such little pretension. Everyone adored Elizabeth. If the servants had any request to make, it was always through her intercession. We were strangers to any species of disunion and disputes, for although there were a great dissimilitude of our characters, there was a harmony in that very dissimilitude. I was more calm and philosophical than my companion, yet my temper was not so yielding. My application was of longer endurance, but it was not so severe whilst it endured. I delighted in investigation the facts relative to the actual world. She busied herself in following the aerial creations of the poets. The world to me was a secret, which I was destined to discover. To her, it was a vacancy which she sought to people with imaginations of her own. My brothers were considerably younger than myself, but I had a friend in one of my schoolfellows who compensated for this deficiency. Henry Clerval was the son of the merchants of Geneva, an intimate friend of my father. He was a boy of singular talent and fancy. I remember, when he was 9 years old, he wrote a fairy tale, which was the delight and amazement of all his companions. His favorite study consisted in books of chivalry and romance, and when very young, I can remember that we used to act plays composed by him out of those favorite books, the principal characters of which were Orlando, Robin Hood, Amadis, and St. George. No youth could have passed more happily than mine. My parents were indulgent, and my companions amiable. Our studies were never forced, and by some means we always had an ended place in view, which excited us to ardor in the prosecution of them. It was by this method, and not by emulation, that we were urged to application. Elizabeth was not incited to apply herself to drawing, that her companions might not outstrip her, but through desire for pleasing her aunt, and by representation of some favorite scene done by her own hand. We learned Latin and English, that we might read the writings of those languages, and so far from study being made odious to us through punishments, we loved application, and our amusements would have been the labors of other children. Perhaps we did not read so many books, or learn languages so quickly, and those who were disciplined according to the ordinary methods, but what we learned was impressive the more deeply in our own memories. In this description of our domestic circle, I include Henry Clerval, for he was consistently with us. He went to school with me and generally passed the afternoon at our house. For being an only child and destitute of companions at home, his father was well pleased that he should find associates at our house, and we were never completely happy when Clevel was absent. I feel pleasure in dwelling with the reconciliations of childhood, before misfortune had tainted my mind and changed its bright visions of extensive usefulness into gloomy and narrow reflections upon self. But in drawing the picture of my early days, I must not omit the record of those events which led, by insensible steps, to my after-tale of misery. For when I would recount to myself the birth of that passion, which afterwards ruled my destiny, I find it arise, like a mountain river, from the ignoble and almost forgotten sources, but swelling as it proceeded, as it became a torrent which, in its course, has swept away all my hopes and joys. Natural philosophy is the genius that has regulated my fate. I desire, therefore, in this narration, to state those facts which led me to predilection of that for science. When I was 13 years of age, we all went to a party of pleasure to the baths of Thornton. The inclemency of the weather obligated us to remain a day confined in the inn. In this house I chanced to find a volume of the works of Cornelius Agrippa. I opened it with apathy, the theory of which he attempts to demonstrate, and the wonderful facts which he relates soon changed this feeling into enthusiasm. A new light seemed to dawn upon my mind, and, bounding with joy, I communicated the discovery with my father. I cannot help remarking here that many opportunities instructors possess in directing my attention of their pupils to such useful knowledge, when they utterly neglect. My father looked carelessly at the title page of the book, and said, "Ah, Cornelius Agrippa. My dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this. It is sad trash." If, instead of this remark, my father had taken the pains to explain to me that the principles of Agrippa had been entirely exploded, and that a modern system of science had been introduced, which possessed much greater powers than the ancient, because the powers of the latter were chimerical, while those of the former were real and practical. Under such circumstances, I should certainly have thrown Agrippa aside, and, with my imagination warmed as it was, should probably have applied myself to a more rational theory of chemistry, which has resulted in modern discoveries. It is even possible that the train of my ideas would never have received the fatal impulse that led to my ruin. But the cursory glance my father had taken of my volume by no means assured me that he was acquainted with its concerns, and I continued to read with the greatest avidity. When I returned home, my first care was to procure the whole works of this author, and afterwards from Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. I read and studied the wild fancies of these writers with delight. They appeared to me treasures known to few beside myself, and although I have often wished to communicate their secret stores of knowledge to my father, yet his indefinite censure of my favorite Agrippa always withheld me. I disclosed my discoveries to Elizabeth, therefore, under promise of strict secrecy. But she did not interest herself in the subject, and I was left by her to pursue my studies alone. It may appear very strange that a disciple of Albertus Magnus should arise as the 18th century, but our family was not scientifical, and I had not attended any of the lectures given at the schools of Geneva. My dreams were therefore undisturbed by reality, and I entered with great diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. But the latter obtained my undivided attention. Wealth of an inferior object. But what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame, and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death? Nor were these my only visions. The raising of ghosts or devils was a promise liberally recorded to my favorite authors, the fulfillment of which I most eagerly sought. And if my incantations were always unsuccessful, I attributed the failure to my own inexperience and mistaken that once a skill or fidelity in my instructors. The natural phenomena that take place every day before our eyes did not escape my examinations. Distillation and the wonderful effects of steam, process of which my favorite authors were utterly ignorant, excited my astonishment. But my utmost wonder was engaged in some experiments with an air pump, which I saw employed by a gentleman whom we were in the habit of visiting. The ignorance of my early philosophers on these and several other points served to decrease my credit with me, but I could not entirely throw them aside, for some other system should occupy their place in my mind. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house in Belgrove, when we witnessed the most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. I remained while the storm lasted, watching the progress in curiosity and delight. As I stood by the door, on the sudden, I beheld a stream of fire issue from the old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from the house. And as so stood by the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared. Nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a single manner. It was not splintered by a shock, but entirely reduced to ribbons of wood, and I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. The catastrophe of this tree excited my extreme astonishment, and I eagerly inquired of my father the nature and the origin of thunder and lightning. He replied, "Electricity," describing at the same time the various effects of the power. He constructed a small electric engine and exhibited a few experiments with it. He also made a kite with a wire and string which drew down the fluid from the clouds. This last stroke completed my overthrow of Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, who had long reigned the lords of my imagination. But by some fatality, I did not feel inclined to commence the study of any modern system. This disinclination was influenced by my following circumstance. My father expressed a wish that I should attend a course in lectures on natural philosophy, to which I cheerfully consented. Some accident prevented my attending these lectures until the course was nearly finished. The lecture, being therefore one of the last, was entirely incomprehensible to me. The professor discouraged with the greatest fluency of potassium and boron, of sulfates and oxides, terms of which I could not fix an idea, and I had begun disgusted with the science of natural philosophy, although I still read Pliny and Buffon with delight. Authors, in my estimation, were nearly equal of interest and utility. My occupations at this age were principally as mathematics and most of the branches of the science studies pertaining to that science. I was busily employed in learning languages. Language, Latin, was already familiar to me, and I began to read some of the easiest Greek authors without help of a lexicon. I also perfectly understood English and German. This is the list of my accomplishments at the age of 17. And you may conceive that my hours were fully employed in acquiring and maintaining the knowledge of the various literature. Another task was devolved upon me when I became the instructor of my brothers. Ernest was 6 years younger than myself, and was my principal pupil. He had been afflicted with ill health in his infancy, of which Elizabeth and I had been constant nurses. The disposition was gentle, and he was incapable of any severe application. William, the youngest of our family, was yet an infant, and the most beautiful little fellow in the world. His lively blue eyes, dimpled cheeks, and endearing manners inspired the tenderest affection. Such was our domestic circle, from which care and pain seemed ever banished. My father directed our studies, and my mother partook in our enjoyments. Neither of us possessed the slightest preeminence over the other. The voice of command was never heard amongst us. The mutual affection engaged us all to comply and obey with the slightest desire of each other. Ouch. Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. Check something real quick. How many chapters does this book have? Because 23 chapters. We've been going for an hour and a half. I think I will try to get one more chapter in tonight. I haven't really set times for the stream, so. Chapter 2. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student in the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it was necessary, for the completion of my education, that I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever, but her illness was not severe, and she quickly recovered. During her confinement, many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that her favorite was recovering, she could no longer debar herself from her society, and entered the chamber long before the danger of infection had passed. The consequences of this impudence were fatal. On the third day my mother sickened. Her fever was very malignant, and the looks of her attendants prognosticated the worst events. On her deathbed, the fortitude and her benignity of this admirable woman did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness are placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to your younger cousins. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you, and happy and beloved as I have been, it is not hard to quit all of you. But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those dearest ties and rents by the irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that is exhibited by its countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she, whom we saw every day, whose very existence appeared as part of her own, can have departed forever, and that brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of evil, and the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not that rude hand rent away the dear connection? And why should I describe the sorrow which I have felt and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity. A smile that will play upon the lips, although it may be deeming a sacrilege, is not banished. My mother was dead, but she had still duties which ought to be performed. We must continue our course with the rest, and learn to think ourselves fortunate, whilst one remains whom the spoiler has not seized. My journey to Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained from my father a respite of some weeks. This period was spent sadly. My mother's death and my speedy departure depressed our spirits. But Elizabeth endeavored to renew the spirit of the cheerfulness of our little society. Since the death of her aunt, her mind had acquired new firmness and vigor. She determined to fulfill the duties of her greatest exactness, and she felt that the most imperious duty of rendering her uncle and cousins happy was devolved upon her. She consoled me, bemused her uncle, and instructed my brothers, and I never beheld so enchanting at this time, when she was continually endeavoring to contribute to the happiness of others, entirely forgetful of herself. The day of my departure at length arrived. I had taken leave of all my friends, excepting Clerval, who spent the last evening with us. He bitterly lamented that he was unable to accompany me, but his father could not be persuaded to part with him, intending that he should become a partner with him in his business, in compliance with his favorite theory, and learning that superfluous in the commerce of ordinary life. Henry had a refined mind. He had no desire to be idle, and was well pleased to become his father's partner. But he believed that man might become a very good trader, and yet possess a cultivated understanding. We sat late, listening to his complaints, and making many little arrangements of the future. The next morning early I departed. Tears gushed from the eyes of Elizabeth. They proceeded partly from sorrow at my departure, and partly because she reflected the same journey was to have taken place 3 months before, when a mother's blessing would have accompanied me. I threw myself into the chaise that was to convey me away, and indulged in the most melancholy reflections. I, who was never to be surrounded by amicable companions, continually engaged in endeavoring to bestow mutual pleasure. I was now alone. In the university, whither I was going, I must form new friends, and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance in new countenances. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey, was that as I proceeded my spirits and hopes rose. I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain during my youth cooped up in one place, and had longed to enter the world, and take my station among the other human beings. Now my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. I had sufficient leisure for these, and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. At length my high white steeple of the town met my eyes. I alighted, and was conducted to my solitary apartments to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction, and paid a visit to some of the principal professors, and among others to M. Kremke, professor of natural philosophy. He received me with politeness and asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science pertaining to natural philosophy. I mentioned, it is true, with my fear and trembling, the only authors I had ever read upon those subjects. The professor stared. "Have you," he said, "really spent your time in studying such nonsense?" I replied in the affirmative. Every minute, continued Mr. Crumpy with warmth. Every instance that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God! In what desert land have you lived, where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies, which you have so greedily imbibed, are 1,000 years old, and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected this enlightened scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus or Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely new. Damn. So saying, he stepped aside and wrote down a list of several books treating the natural philosophy, which he desired me to procure, and dismissed me after mentioning that at the beginning of the following week he intended to commence a course of lectures upon natural philosophy and its general relations, and that M. Waldman, a fellow professor, would lecture upon chemistry in the alternate days he missed. I returned home, not disappointed, for I had long considered those authors useless when the professor had so strongly reprobated. But I did not feel much inclined to study the books which I had procured at his recommendation. M. Kremke was a little squat man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not press me in the favor of his doctrine. Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was very different when the masters of science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene had changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions in which my interest in science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras for boundless grandeur of realities of little worth. Such were my reflections during the first 2 or 3 days spent almost in solitude. But as the ensuing week commenced, I thought of the information which M. Kremke had given me concerning the lectures, and although I could not consent to go and hear the little conceited fellow deliver sentences out of the pulpit, I recollected what he had said about M. Waldman, whom I had never seen, as he was hitherto been out of town. Partly from curiosity and partly from idleness, I went to the lecturing room, which M. Waldman entered shortly after. The professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared to be about 50 years of age, but with the aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those in the back of his head were nearly black. This person was short, but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I had ever heard. He began his lecture with a recapitulation of the history of chemistry, and the various improvements made by different men of learning, pronouncing with fervor the names of the most distinguished discoverers. Then he took a cursory view of the present state of science, and explained many of its elementary terms. After having made a few proprietary experiments, he concluded with the panegyric of modern chemistry, terms of which I shall never forget. The ancient teachers of the science, he said, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that the metals cannot be transmuted, and the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore with a microscope of crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature, and shew how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates, and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunder of heavens, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. I departed highly pleased with this professor and his lecture, and paid him a visit the same evening. His manners in private were even more mild and attractive than in public, for there a certain dignity of his mien during lecture, which in his own house he replaced with the greatest affability and kindness. He heard with attention my little narration concerning my studies, and smiled at the names of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, but without the contempt that M. Company had existed. He said that these were men who were indefatigable. Zeal modern philosophies were inbred from most of the foundations of history. They had left us as an easy task to give them new names, arrange the connected classifications, the facts which they in a great degree had the instrumentation of bringing to light. The labors of men, genius, however, erroneously directed, scarcely ever fall, and ultimately turning into a solid advantage of mankind. I listened to his statement, which was delivered without any presumption or affection, and then added that his lecture had removed my prejudices against modern chemists, and that I, at the same time, requested his advice concerning the books I thought to procure. "I am happy," said M. Waldman, "to have gained a disciple, and if your application equals your inability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is a branch of natural philosophy, in which the greatest improvements have been made, and may be made. It is on the account that I have made my particular study. But at the same time I have not neglected the other branches of science. Man would make but a very sorry chemist if he attended to the department of human knowledge alone. If your wish is to become really a man of science and not merely a petty experimentalist, I should advise you to apply to every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics." Then he took me to his laboratory, and explained to me the uses of various machines, instructing me as to what I ought to procure, and promising me the use of his own, which, when I should have advanced far enough in science to not derange their mechanism. He also gave me a list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. Thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny. Maybe one of those times I'm going to read another chapter. Yeah, I'm going to read another chapter. Chapter 3. From this day, natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry, in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardor those works, so full of genius and discrimination, which modern inquirers have written on those subjects. I attended the lectures, and I cultivated the acquaintance with the men of science in the university, and I found even that M. Kremke a great deal of sound sense and real information combined, it is true, with a repulsive physiognomy and manners, but not on the account the less valuable. In M. Waldman I found a true friend. His gentleness was never tinged to dogmatism, and instructions were given with an air of frankness, that good nature that had banished every idea of pedantry. It was, perhaps, the amicable character of the man that inclined me more to that branch of natural philosophy which he professed, than an intrinsic love of science itself. But the state of mind had only placed the first steps towards knowledge. I more fully entered into the science, more exclusively I pursued it for my own sake. The application, which at first had been a matter of duty and resolution, now became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of morning whilst I was yet engaged in my laboratory. I was applied so closely, it may be easily conceived that I improved rapidly. My ardor was indeed an astonishment of the students, and my proficiency that of the masters. Professor Kremke often asked me, with a sly smile, how Cornelius Agrippa went on, whilst M. Waldman expressed the most heartfelt exultation in my progress. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but was engaged, heart and soul, to the pursuits of some discoveries which I hoped to make. None but those who have experienced them can conceive the excitements of science. In other sciences, you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit of a continual food for discovery and wonder, a mind of moderate capacity which closely pursues one study must infallibly arrive at great proficiency in that study, and I, who continually sought the attainment of one such object of pursuit, and was solely wrapped up in it, improved so rapidly that at the end of 2 years I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me a great esteem and admiration of the university. When I had arrived at this point, and had become well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy, as depended on the lessons of any of the professors at Eglinton, my residence there no longer being conducive of my preference, I thought of returning to my friends in the native town, when an ancient incident happened that protected my stay. One of the phenomena which had peculiarly attracted my attention to the structure of the human frame, and indeed any animal endued with life, whence I often asked myself the principle of life proceeded. It was a bold question, and one which has ever so considered to be a mystery, yet with how things are we blink upon being acquainted, if cowardice or carelessness did not retain our inquiries. I revolved these circumstances in my mind, and determined thenceforth to apply myself more particularly to those branches of natural philosophy which relates to physiology. Unless I had been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to the study would have been irksome and almost intolerable. To examine the causes of life, we must first recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken great precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at the tale of superstition, or have been feared the apparition of spirits. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard was to me merely a receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which, from being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for the worm. Now I was to examine the cause and progress of this decay, and forced to spend my days and nights in vaults or channel houses. My attention was fixed upon every object and the unsupportable to the delicacy of human feelings. I saw how the fine form of a man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and the brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of constitution, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, till from the midst of the darkness a sudden light broke upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius who had directed their inquiries towards the same science, that I alone should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman. The sun does not more certainly shine in the heavens which I now affirm is true. Some miracle might have produced it, yet the stages of discovery were distinct and probable. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. The astonishment which I had first experienced on this discovery soon gave place to delight and rapture. After so much time spent in painful labor to arrive at once at the summit of my desires, was the most gratifying consummation of my toils. But this discovery was too great and overwhelming that all the steps by which I had been progressively led to it were obliterated, and I beheld only the result. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world was now within my grasp. Not that, like this magic scene, it all opened upon me at once. The information I had obtained was of nature rather than direct endeavors, so soon as I should point them toward the object of my search, to exhibit that object already accomplished. I was like the Arabian who had been buried with the dead, and found passage to life aided only by one glimmering, seemingly ineffectual light. I see by your eagerness, and the wonder and hope in your eyes expressed, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved upon that subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I was then, with your destruction and unfailable misery. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be in the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. When I found so astonishingly a power placed within my hands, I hesitated a long time concerning the manner in which I should employ it. Although I possessed the capacity for bestowing animation, yet to prepare a frame for the reception of it, all its intricacies and fibers and muscles and veins, still remained a work of inconceivable difficulty and labor. I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself, or one of a simpler organization. But my imagination was too much exalted from my first success to permit me the doubt of any ability to give life to an animal as complex and as wonderful as man. The materials at present within my command hardly appeared adequate to the arduous undertaking, but I doubted not that I should be ultimately successful. I prepared myself for a multitude of reverses. My operations might be incessantly baffled, and at last my work might be imperfect. Yet when I considered the improvement which every day takes place in science and mechanics, I had encouraged the hope my present attempts would at least lay the foundations of future success. Nor could I consider the magnitude and complexity of my plan as any arguments of its impracticality. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. As the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first interaction, to make the being of a gigantic stature. That is to say, about 8 feet in height, and proportionally large. After having formed this determination and having spent some months successfully collecting and arranging my materials, I began. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards, like a hurricane, in its first enthusiasm of science. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds, which I should break through first, then pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source, Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of a child so completely as I should desire theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might, in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoured the body to consumption. These thoughts supported my spirits while I pursued my undertaking with unremitting ardor. My cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Sometimes, on the very brink of certainty, I failed, yet I still clung to the hope on which the next day or the next hour might realize. One secret which I alone promised was the hope to which I had dedicated myself, and the moon gazed on my midnight labors, while, with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness, I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil, as I dabbled among the unfollowed damps of the grave, and tortured the living animal to animate its lifeless clay? My limbs now tremble, and my eyes swim with remembrance, but then a resistless, an almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seemed to have lost all soul and sensation of my own pursuits. It was indeed but passing trance. They only made me feel with renewed acuteness so soon, the unnatural stimulus ceasing to operate. I had returned to my old habits. I collected bones from charnel houses, and disturbed, with profane fingers, the tremendous secrets of the human frame. In a solitary chamber, or rather cell, at the top of the house, and separated from all the other apartments of the gallery and staircase, I kept working my workshop of filthy creation. My eyeballs were staring from their sockets and attending to the details of my employment. The dissecting room and slaughterhouse furnished many of my materials, and often did my human nature turn to loathing for my occupation, while still urged on by my eagerness, which perpetually increased. I brought my work near to a conclusion. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul in one pursuit. It was the most beautiful season. Never did fields bestow a more beautiful harvest, or the vines yield a more luxuriant vintage. But my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature, and the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me to also forget those friends who were so many miles absent, and whom I had not seen for a long time. I knew my silence disquieted them, and I well remembered the words of my father. I know that while you are pleased with yourself, you will thank us with affection, and we shall hear regularly from you. You must pardon me if I regard the interruption in your correspondence as a proof that your other duties are equally neglected. I knew well, therefore, what would be my father's feelings, but I could not tear my thoughts from my employment, loathsome in itself, but which had taken an irrepressible hold of my imagination. I wished, as it were, to procrastinate all that related to my feelings of affection until the great objects which swallowed up every habit of my nature should be completed. I then thought that my father would be unjust if he ascribed my negligence to vice, or faultiness to my part. But I am now convinced that he is justified in conceiving that I should not be altogether free from blame. The human being in perfection ought always be preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never to allow passion or transitory desire to disturb this tranquillity. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections, and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not befitting of a human mind. This rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with her tranquillity and domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved. Caesar would not have spared his country. America would not have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru would not have been destroyed. But I forget that I'm moralizing the most interesting part of my tale, and your look reminds me to proceed. My father made no reproach in his letters, and only took notice of my silence in inquiring of my occupations, more particularly than before. Spring, winter, summer, all passed between my labors, but I did not watch the blossom or the expanding leaves, sights which always yielded me supreme delights, so deeply I was engrossed in my occupation. The leaves of that year had withered before my work drew near to a close, and now every day shewed me the more painfully how plain I had succeeded. But my enthusiasm was checked by my anxiety. It appeared rather like one doomed to slavery, to toil in the mines, or another unwholesome trade, than an artist occupied by his favorite enjoyments. Every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, and I became nervous to a most painful degree, a disease that I regretted the more because I had hitherto enjoyed the most excellent health, and had always boasted to the firmness of my nerves. But I believed that exercise and amusement would both soon drive away such symptoms, and I promised myself both of these when my creation would be complete. Okay, yep. That was the end of chapter 3. So, I'll have to make note of that. Uh, I still kept to 2 hours, so I'm doing pretty good. So, basically, 4 chapters worth of reading, 2 hours. Oh yeah, should be able to get this book done pretty good. Well, so, let's see who's on We Can Read. The desk is still on, I guess. Yep, desk is still on. Let's see. Let's see, Ursula from Scotty. Any readers on right now? Oh, Snows on, but I didn't do her this week. Uh, Michael Wazzy just came on. What is other than Psychonauts? Let me open theirs real quick. What they're up to. Hey. They're still getting started. That'll be in a couple minutes. Hold on. Let's check something. Not get there affiliated. I really want to raid more people who aren't affiliated yet because, I'm kind of in the same boat they are. Damn it, is anyone not affiliated yet? happening? Okay. See, Fishes is on. They're not an affiliate yet, but it's doing first-person shooters, so it's not something to follow up reading Frankenstein with. Psychotic girl. I don't know, Cubs. So affiliate. Could be really tacky and red Takahata. HBO just came on. I don't know, Cubs. Don't want to raid. See, Mokazaki just came on. Baron just came on. I think he's already got his affiliate. Baron's not affiliated yet. And their audio is quiet. We got 199 followers. You want to see what's up over there? Oh, wait. Machi. She just followed me, so. Pretty sure it's Machi. What? Really? Cubs, I can't find anyone to raid, so I might just go ahead and call it for the night. Let's switch this closers in. Thank you everyone who came in alert. Guilty, always nice to know you're around. I'm gonna go ahead and fix my schedule so it says that I'm doing this now, since I didn't wanted to do kind of the whole reveal thing. But yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and end it for tonight. So have a good night, Cubs, and we will definitely be doing more Frankenstein next week. And I said we got 4 chapters worth done tonight, so we should be pretty good pace. So we'll end up hitting Dracula by October. So yeah, if I can do 4 chapters a night, Dracula before at least Halloween. Anyway, have a good night, Cubs. Don't animate dead bodies or anything. Okay. Good night.